My name is Erin Matthews. I am 34 years old. And 3 hours before my wedding, my father told me he would rather watch me walk down the aisle alone than stand beside me. He said it quietly. That hurt more. I was standing in the bridal suite with one earring in my hand when he closed the door behind him. My dress was already on. My hair was pinned exactly the way my mother used to wear hers for special occasions. Downstairs, 112 guests were drinking champagne beneath strings of white lights. My father would not look at me. I asked him what had happened. He rubbed his wedding ring with his thumb and said he had made his decision weeks ago. Weeks. He had known for weeks. Then why had he come to the rehearsal dinner? Why had his name remained on the wedding program? Why had he hugged me that morning and told me my mother would have been proud I asked him those questions? He answered none of them. Instead, he told me there were things about my engagement I did not understand, and that someday I might thank him for refusing. Then he left. Just like that. For several seconds, I stared at the closed door. No tears came. Not yet. Then my phone vibrated on the dressing table. A message from my younger brother, Caleb. Do not let Dad leave before you see what I sent you. Underneath was a photograph of a document I had never seen before. My father's signature was at the bottom. So was my fiancé Daniel's name. And suddenly his refusal to walk me down the aisle did not feel like rejection anymore. It felt like a warning. Before I tell you what happened next, if you're enjoying this story so far, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It truly helps this channel reach more people who love emotional family stories like these. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in her place? I'm curious to read your thoughts. I enlarged the photograph with shaking fingers. The document had been signed 8 months earlier, 2 months before Daniel proposed to me. I read the first page, then the second. By the time I reached the final paragraph, I understood why my father had refused to stand beside me. What I did not understand was why he had waited until my wedding day to make me discover that the man waiting for me at the altar had entered my life with my father's help. Until that afternoon, I had spent most of my life believing my father was incapable of surprising me. Thomas Matthews was predictable in the way old clocks were predictable. He woke at 5:40 every morning. Coffee first, black, local news second, work by 7. For 32 years, he had run Matthews Restoration, a small construction company outside Richmond that repaired old homes, churches, and historic buildings. He could look at a cracked foundation and tell you whether it had moved recently. He could run his hand across a wooden floor and tell you roughly when it had been installed. People trusted him. I trusted him more than anyone. After my mother died when I was 26, that trust became something heavier, almost like duty. Mom had been the soft place in our family. Dad was the structure. Caleb was the restless one who changed jobs twice before turning 25. And I became the person who kept everything together. I handled Mom's medical bills after she died. I helped Dad organize insurance paperwork he refused to understand. I remembered Caleb's birthdays, even when Dad forgot to call him until dinner. I never thought of it as sacrifice. It was simply what I did. Maybe that was why nobody noticed how much of my own life I had postponed. I worked as an operations manager for a commercial property company. The job was not glamorous, but I liked it. Problems arrived every morning, and by 5, I could usually point to something I had fixed. Broken lease, delayed contractor, insurance dispute, missing invoice. There was comfort in problems that could be solved. Daniel Mercer appeared in my life through one of those problems. One of our properties needed emergency structural repairs after a water line burst beneath an exterior wall. My regular contractor could not start for 3 weeks. Dad recommended Daniel. He told me Daniel had worked with him on several restoration projects and was one of the few younger contractors he trusted. That mattered to me. The first time Daniel walked into my office, he carried rolled blueprints under one arm and apologized because there was mud on his boots. He was 37, calm, funny, without trying too hard. And unlike most men I had dated, he never seemed intimidated by the fact that I had opinions. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. 2 weeks after the project ended, he called and asked if taking me to dinner would violate some imaginary contractor ethics code. I laughed. That was our beginning. Or at least I thought it was. For the first year, Daniel fit into my life so naturally that I barely noticed how quickly he became part of it. Dad liked him. That was unusual. My father had found something wrong with every man I had dated since college. One talked too much. Another changed careers too often. One apparently held a hammer incorrectly, which Dad mentioned for 3 years. Daniel passed every test. They talked construction at Sunday dinners. Sometimes Daniel stopped by Dad's workshop without me. Once, when my kitchen faucet started leaking, I came home to find both of them underneath the sink arguing about baseball. I stood in the doorway smiling. I remember thinking, this is what family is supposed to feel like. That memory hurt later, because there had been signs, small ones, easy to explain. The first happened about 6 months before Daniel proposed. Dad and I were sitting in his office going through paperwork for the company. He had started talking about retirement more often, not immediately, maybe in 3 or 4 years. Matthews Restoration owned the workshop, several vehicles, specialized equipment, and the small parcel of commercial land beneath the business. Dad had built everything slowly. He had never become wealthy. But the company was valuable, more valuable than I realized. That afternoon, I found an appraisal tucked inside a folder. The number made me stop. I asked Dad why he had valued the business. He took the paper from my hand. Just planning ahead. I asked whether he was selling. He said no. Then he changed the subject. A week later, Daniel asked me whether I had ever considered taking over my father's company. The question seemed ridiculous. I knew property operations, contracts, budgets, and vendors. I did not know how to restore a 19th century staircase. I told him Caleb would probably inherit it. Daniel looked surprised. Why Caleb? Because he is Dad's son, I said. Daniel stared at me for a second. So are you, in every way that matters. I laughed and corrected him. Daughter, he smiled. You know what I mean. At the time, I thought it was sweet. Now I wondered why he had been asking. 3 months later, Dad suffered a mild heart episode while inspecting a job site. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to frighten us. For several weeks, I drove him to appointments, organized his medication, and took over some administrative work at Matthews Restoration. That was when I learned how messy the business had become. Dad was brilliant with buildings. Paperwork was another matter. Invoices were stacked in drawers. Contracts lived in folders that had not been labeled since 2019. Some clients still mailed checks because Dad refused to modernize the payment system. Daniel started helping too. Too much, perhaps. He introduced Dad to a business attorney named Robert Kessler. He helped move several vendor agreements into digital files. He suggested restructuring the company so Dad could retire without selling everything at once. Dad seemed grateful. I was grateful too. One evening, I arrived at the workshop and found Daniel sitting behind Dad's desk. Dad was standing near the filing cabinet. Both stopped talking when I entered. That silence lasted maybe 2 seconds, but I noticed it. I asked what they were discussing. Taxes, Daniel said. Dad nodded. Taxes. I joked that nothing made 2 grown men look guiltier than taxes. Neither laughed. That should have stayed with me. It did not. Life became busy. Dad recovered. Daniel proposed. The wedding consumed everything. Then something changed between the 2 men. It happened gradually. Daniel stopped visiting the workshop. Dad stopped mentioning him. At Sunday dinner, their conversations became short and painfully polite. I asked Daniel whether they had argued. He said it was business. I asked Dad the same question. He said Daniel had become ambitious. That word bothered me. Ambitious how Dad would not explain. I pushed once. He snapped at me. Leave it alone, Erin. My father almost never raised his voice at me. I left his house furious. Daniel found me crying in my car. He climbed into the passenger seat and waited until I calmed down. Then he told me Dad was having trouble accepting retirement. He said men like my father sometimes confuse control with usefulness. I defended Dad. Daniel apologized immediately. That made me trust him more. There was always an explanation, always something reasonable. 2 weeks before the wedding, Dad asked me to meet him alone for breakfast. He chose a diner near his workshop. When I arrived, he already had coffee waiting for me. He looked exhausted. He asked whether Daniel and I had signed a prenuptial agreement. I nearly choked on my coffee. No. Dad asked whether we had discussed one. Again, no. Then he asked something stranger. Had Daniel ever asked me about my mother's trust? I stared at him. My mother had inherited money from her parents. Most of it had been used during her illness, but she had left a trust containing investment accounts and partial ownership in 2 rental properties. It was not enormous, but it was significant. I had never hidden it from Daniel. Why are you asking me this? Dad looked toward the window. I need you to promise me something. What? Do not sign anything Daniel gives you before the wedding. I laughed because I thought he was being dramatic. Dad did not. Promise me. I promised. Then I asked what was happening. He said he needed more time. That was all. More time. The following week, Dad almost canceled his attendance at the rehearsal dinner. Caleb convinced him to come. Dad sat beside my aunt and barely spoke. Daniel behaved perfectly. He thanked Dad during his toast. He said he hoped to become the kind of husband my father could respect. Everyone applauded. Dad stared at his plate. After dinner, I followed him into the parking lot. I demanded an explanation. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said something I could not forget. Sometimes protecting someone too late looks exactly like betraying them. I asked what that meant. He got into his truck. The next morning was my wedding day. And now, hours before I was supposed to marry Daniel, I stood in my bridal suite reading the document Caleb had photographed. It was titled as a preliminary transfer agreement. The language was dense, but contracts were part of my job. I understood enough. 8 months earlier, my father had apparently agreed to begin transferring a controlling interest in Matthews Restoration to a newly formed company, Mercer Holdings, Daniel's company. My stomach tightened. I kept reading. There were references to future ownership, property rights, equipment, client contracts. Then I reached a paragraph mentioning an anticipated family consolidation following marriage. My hands went cold. I called Caleb. He answered immediately. Where did you get this? Dad's office. Why were you in Dad's files? Because he asked me to find it. I stopped. Dad asked you this morning. Then why didn't he give it to me himself? Caleb went quiet. Erin, Dad thought Daniel had the original. I sat down slowly. The room suddenly felt too bright. What are you talking about? Caleb lowered his voice. Dad signed that agreement because Daniel told him it was the first step in a retirement buyout. Dad thought Daniel was going to purchase part of the company over several years. That was not what the document said. I knew that. So did Caleb. I asked the question anyway. What changed? Caleb exhaled. Dad found another version of what the agreement. My fingers tightened around the phone. Caleb continued. Same date, same deal, but different language on 3 pages. I stood up. Where is it? Dad has it. Then why did he leave? Because Daniel called him before he came upstairs to see you. My chest tightened. What did Daniel say? I don't know. Dad wouldn't tell me. I walked toward the window. Below me, guests were beginning to take their seats. White chairs, flowers, music. Everything looked perfect. My phone buzzed. Daniel. I answered. His voice was gentle. Hey, are you okay? I looked at the photograph on my screen. My father's signature. Daniel's signature. 2 versions of the same agreement. I forced my voice to stay steady. Dad won't walk me down the aisle. Silence. Only for a second. Then Daniel sighed. I'm sorry, you don't sound surprised. Another pause. Erin, your father and I have been dealing with something complicated. Today isn't the day for it. That sentence changed something inside me. Not fear, not yet. Clarity. I asked where he was. Downstairs. Can you come up? He hesitated. The coordinator said we're not supposed to see each other. I looked at myself in the mirror. White dress, perfect hair, my mother's earrings. A woman prepared for a future she suddenly knew almost nothing about. I said I did not care about tradition anymore. Daniel agreed to come. I ended the call. Then Caleb sent me another photograph. This one was not a contract. It was an email. Daniel had written it to my father 4 months earlier. I read the first lines twice, then a third time. Daniel was demanding that Dad honor what he called their original understanding. But one sentence made my knees weak, because Daniel had written that my marriage would complete the arrangement whether my father cooperated or not. A knock sounded at the bridal suite door. Daniel had arrived. I opened the door before Daniel could knock again. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He was already dressed for the ceremony. Dark suit, white shirt, the navy tie I had bought him for Christmas. His boutonniere had not been pinned on yet. He smiled when he saw me. Then he noticed my phone. The smile disappeared. I stepped aside. "Come in." Daniel closed the door behind him. "You look beautiful." Normally, those words would have mattered. Now they barely reached me. I held up my phone. "What was the original understanding between you and my father?" Daniel froze. Just slightly, but I saw it. "What are you talking about?" I turned the screen toward him. "The email. His email." His eyes moved across it, and his jaw tightened. "Where did you get that?" Wrong answer. I had spent years negotiating contracts with people who tried to avoid difficult questions. They usually made the same mistake. They challenged the evidence before denying the accusation. I asked again. "What arrangement?" Daniel walked toward the window. "Erin, your father and I had a business disagreement." "Then explain it. Today? Especially today." He rubbed both hands over his face. The company was struggling. I stared at him. "Dad's company?" Daniel nodded. "Cash flow problems. Old equipment. Several projects were underbid. Your father had also personally guaranteed a line of credit." I knew about the credit line. I did not know it had become a problem. "How much?" "About $280,000 at its highest point." My stomach tightened. Dad had never told me. Daniel continued. "He needed capital. I wanted to expand. We discussed a partnership. And Mercer Holdings, my company." "I know that." My voice sharpened. "Why does the agreement give your company control?" "It wasn't supposed to happen immediately, but it could happen." Daniel did not answer. I looked down at the photograph again. Then I noticed something I had missed before. The document referred to an option. An option triggered by a change in family ownership. I asked Daniel what that meant. He turned toward me. It was legal language. I almost laughed. "I work with contracts, Daniel. I know what legal language looks like." His expression changed. Not dramatically. The warmth simply left it. That frightened me more. I asked him whether marrying me affected his rights to Matthew's restoration. "No. Too fast." I waited. Daniel corrected himself. Not directly. There it was. The first crack. "Explain indirectly." He sat in one of the chairs near the dressing table. "Your mother's trust owns part of the land beside the workshop. I knew that. Mom's parents had purchased several parcels decades ago. After my grandfather died, ownership had been divided through trusts and family entities. I had never paid much attention because the land produced modest rental income, and an accountant handled everything," Daniel continued. "Matthew's Restoration owns the building. Your trust owns 40% of the underlying parcel." I stared at him. Dad had never explained that. And suddenly I understood why Daniel had once asked about my mother's trust. "If you married me, what happened?" "Nothing automatically." That word mattered. Automatically. What could happen? Daniel looked away. "If we combined certain assets later, Mercer Holdings could consolidate the property and the operating company." My throat went dry. "Later?" "After we were married." Daniel stood. "Erin, listen to me. None of this means I married you for property. We're not married yet." He stopped. The sentence landed between us. I asked the question I was afraid to ask. "Did you meet me because my father introduced us, or because you were already negotiating for his company?" Daniel's face gave me the answer before his mouth did. I stepped backward. "You were already negotiating." He reached toward me. I moved away. "Don't." He dropped his hand. "Yes. Your father and I had discussed the company before we met." "How long before?" "A few months." The room seemed to tilt. My father had recommended Daniel for my emergency repair project. Daniel had walked into my office carrying blueprints. He had called me afterward. I had believed that was chance followed by attraction. It was not chance. "Did Dad ask you to date me?" "No." "Did you know who I was before you walked into my office?" "Yes." One word. That was enough. I turned away from him. My wedding dress suddenly felt absurd. Thousands of dollars of silk wrapped around a woman who had not even known how her relationship began. Daniel came closer. "Erin, I fell in love with you." I looked at him. When? He blinked. What? When did that happen? He had no answer ready. That hurt. I picked up my phone and called Dad. Voicemail. Again. Nothing. Daniel told me Dad was probably driving. Where? He said he did not know. Another lie. I could hear it now. Once trust breaks, every pause develops a sound. I called Caleb. He answered immediately. Find Dad. I'm trying. Then find the second agreement. Silence. Erin. Find it. I ended the call. Daniel stared at me. What are you doing? My job. He frowned. I manage contracts for a living. You knew that when you proposed to me, so let's stop pretending I can't understand what I'm reading. I pulled the chair toward the table and enlarged every page Caleb had sent. There were schedules attached to the agreement, property descriptions, equipment lists, client accounts. Then I found something else. A reference number beside one amendment. I recognized the formatting. County filing. I opened the public property records website on my phone. Daniel moved toward me. Erin, don't do this right now. Why? Because guests are downstairs. That almost made me smile. 112 guests had somehow become more important than whether my marriage was connected to a business acquisition. I searched the parcel. There it was. My mother's trust. 40%. Matthews Restoration. 60%. Then another filing. Submitted 5 months earlier, an option notice. Mercer Holdings. My heart began pounding. I opened it. Daniel said my name. I raised one hand. Not now. The notice claimed Mercer Holdings had a contractual right to purchase Matthews Restoration's interest in the property if a specified ownership event occurred. The document did not define the event, but it referenced an agreement dated 8 months earlier. The agreement in my hand. I looked up. Does Dad know you filed this? Daniel said nothing. Does he? He stood very still. He knows now. Now, not then. I felt something inside me become calm. Cold calm. The kind I got during emergencies at work when everyone else started panicking. I called our wedding coordinator. I told her the ceremony was delayed. 20 minutes. No announcement beyond that. Daniel stared at me. You can't just delay our wedding. I met his eyes. Watch me. He stepped closer. You're letting your father destroy this because he changed his mind about a business deal. Maybe. Or maybe I'm finally asking why everyone except me knew there was a business deal. That stopped him. My phone rang. Caleb. I answered. I found Dad. Where? Parking lot behind the old courthouse. Why is he there? He wouldn't say. But Erin, I found the other document too. My pulse jumped. Send it. A few seconds later, 12 photographs arrived. I opened the first. Same title. Same date. Same signatures. At first, the agreements looked identical. Then I compared page 4. The wording changed. In Dad's version, Mercer Holdings received a minority interest after satisfying a payment schedule. In Daniel's version, the company could acquire controlling interest after a qualifying ownership event. Page 7 was different too. Then page 9. 3 altered sections. Exactly what Caleb had told me. I looked at Daniel. Which version did my father sign? He stared back at me. Both have his signature. That wasn't my question. He said nothing. I called Dad again. This time, he answered. His voice sounded exhausted. Erin. Where are you? He hesitated. With Caleb. Why did you leave? Because I couldn't stand beside you and pretend I hadn't helped put Daniel in your life. The words hit harder than I expected. I closed my eyes. Did you introduce us because of the company? Partly. My chest tightened. Dad continued before I could speak. I trusted him. I thought he was steady, smart. I thought if the two of you liked each other, maybe someday the business could stay connected to the family instead of being sold. So you planned my life? No. His voice broke. I opened a door I had no right to open. I looked at Daniel. He was watching me carefully. Dad, which agreement did you sign? The first one. The minority purchase? Yes. Did you sign the other version? I thought I was signing duplicate copies. I stopped breathing for a second. Daniel shook his head. That is not what happened. Dad heard him. He's there? Yes. Put me on speaker. I did. Dad's voice changed immediately. Tell her about the amendment, Daniel. Daniel stared at the phone. What amendment? Dad gave a tired laugh. That was when I knew. Because my father had spent his entire life being terrible at deception. Daniel was much better, Dad continued. The amendment you sent Robert Kessler after I refused to transfer control. Daniel's face tightened. Robert represented both sides. No, Dad said. I thought he represented me. I remembered the attorney Daniel had introduced. My stomach dropped. Daniel stepped toward the phone. Thomas, be careful what you're accusing me of. Dad went silent. Then he said something that made Daniel stop moving. I'm not accusing you anymore. I reported it. Reported what? The altered agreement. The room became completely still. Dad explained that he had discovered the second version 6 days earlier after receiving notice about the property option. He had taken both agreements to another attorney. That attorney had told him not to confront Daniel until they preserved the records, emails, electronic signatures, document histories, filing dates. Dad had spent the week gathering everything. That was why he had become distant. That was why he had asked me not to sign anything. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. His answer came quietly. Because I was ashamed, I swallowed. Of what? Of being the person who brought him to you. Daniel shook his head. This is insane. He reached for the door. I moved between him and it. Not because I wanted to trap him. Because I wanted one answer before he left. Did you love me before you learned what my mother's trust owned? His expression hardened. Erin, answer me. He looked at the floor, then back at me. I knew about the trust before our first date. That was not an answer, but it was enough. I stepped away from the door. Daniel opened it. Before leaving, he turned toward me. Your father is not innocent in this. I know. That surprised him. I continued. He treated my future like part of a succession plan. You treated my future like leverage. I don't need either of you to be innocent to know I'm not walking downstairs and marrying you. Daniel stared at me. For the first time that day, he looked frightened. Not heartbroken. Frightened. Then he said something I did not understand. You might want to check what happens if the wedding doesn't happen. He left. I immediately called Dad. What did he mean? Dad did not answer. Caleb did. Erin, there's another document. My stomach sank. What document? We found it in the file Robert sent Dad. I gripped the edge of the table. Caleb's next words came slowly. Daniel borrowed money against the acquisition. What acquisition? Matthews Restoration. I stared at the empty doorway. But he doesn't own Matthews Restoration. Not yet, Caleb said. Then his voice dropped. The loan becomes due if he fails to obtain control. I still did not understand why that involved me. Until Dad finally spoke. Because I co-signed it. Silence. I could hear my own breathing. Dad continued. I thought it was temporary financing for the partnership. How much? He did not answer. Dad, how much? 1.4 million. My knees nearly gave out. Then Caleb said the part that changed everything. Erin, the workshop, and Dad's house are listed as collateral. $1.4 million. My father's house, his workshop. Everything he had spent 32 years building. For several seconds, I could not speak. Then the wedding coordinator knocked. Erin, we're 20 minutes behind. I looked at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me still appeared ready to get married. That felt almost insulting. Give me 10 more minutes. I locked the door. Dad, come back. Erin, I don't think I should. I'm not asking you to walk me down the aisle. I'm asking you to bring every document you have. Silence. Then he said he would. I called my maid of honor, Rachel, and asked her to tell the coordinator there would be no ceremony until I personally gave permission. No explanations, no rumors, just wait. Then I took off my veil. That small movement changed everything. I was no longer preparing for a wedding. I was preparing for a meeting. 25 minutes later, Dad and Caleb entered through the service hallway. Dad looked older than he had that morning. He carried a brown document envelope. I did not hug him. Not yet. Put everything on the table. He did. Loan documents. Corporate filings, emails. The original partnership agreement, the altered version. A letter from the attorney Dad had hired 6 days earlier. I read quickly. The loan was real. Dad had co-signed it 11 months earlier before Daniel and I became engaged. Mercer Holdings had borrowed the money from a private commercial lender to finance equipment purchases and what the documents described as the planned acquisition of Matthews Restoration. I looked at Dad. Why would you sign this? He sat down. Because Daniel showed me projections. He wanted to buy into the company, modernize it, expand commercial restoration. I thought I could retire gradually. That did not explain the collateral. Dad swallowed. The lender wanted security. So you gave them your house? And the workshop. I stared at him. You didn't tell me, I know. Why? Because I knew what you'd say. That was the first thing he said all day that made me angry enough to raise my voice. Exactly. Dad looked down. You knew I would tell you not to risk your home, so you made sure I couldn't. He nodded. No excuses. Just that. It helped more than an excuse would have. Caleb spread several pages across the table. The problem was worse than the loan itself. Daniel had already used almost $900,000. Some had purchased equipment. Some had paid business expenses. But nearly $300,000 had been transferred between accounts Caleb could not identify. I asked how he knew. Dad's new attorney had hired a forensic accountant. That explained the courthouse parking lot. Dad had been meeting the attorney nearby before coming to the venue. Then I noticed a date. The loan had been amended 4 months earlier, the same month Daniel sent Dad the threatening email. I compared the amendment with the acquisition agreement. Then I understood. Daniel had borrowed money based on a transaction he had not completed. He needed control of Matthews Restoration. Without it, the lender could call the loan. Dad nodded. And if they do? I already knew. The collateral could be pursued. Dad's home, the workshop, possibly other business assets depending on what a court ultimately enforced. I sat back. For months, I had believed the tension between Dad and Daniel was about retirement. It was about survival. But one thing still made no sense. My wedding. Daniel had said I should check what happened if it did not happen. I searched the documents again. Nothing. Then Caleb handed me a printed email. This one was between Daniel and Robert Kessler, the attorney. I read it once, then again. They were discussing the land beneath Matthews Restoration. My trust's 40%. Daniel believed that after our marriage, he could persuade me to place my interest into a jointly controlled holding company as part of what he called estate simplification. Not automatically, not secretly. He still needed my signature. That distinction mattered. He could not simply marry me and take my property. He needed me to trust him afterward. Suddenly, several conversations returned to me. Daniel suggesting we consolidate finances after the wedding. Daniel asking whether my trust required trustee approval for property transfers. Daniel joking that married couples should not need separate accountants. Each conversation had seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern. Dad watched my face. I'm sorry, I looked at him. Not yet. He nodded. I turned to Caleb. Where is Daniel? Downstairs, I think. I called the coordinator. She answered immediately. Is Daniel still at the venue? A pause. Yes. Where? Groom's room. Tell him I want to speak with him in the small conference room beside the office. Dad stood. I'm coming. No. Erin, no. This is between me and him first. Dad looked ready to argue. I stopped him. You already made decisions for me once. His shoulders dropped. You're right. That was the moment I knew something between us might eventually be repaired. Not because he apologized, because he listened. I changed nothing about my appearance. I walked through the service corridor in my wedding dress and entered the conference room. Daniel arrived 2 minutes later. He closed the door. So this is really happening. I placed copies of the documents on the table. Sit down. He remained standing. I asked him about the $300,000. His expression changed. What $300,000? The transfers. He looked toward the documents. Your father's been digging. I have. That surprised him. I told him I knew about the loan amendment, the acquisition language, the property option, and the emails with Robert. Daniel finally sat. For the next several minutes, he tried to explain. Some of what he said was probably true. Matthews Restoration had needed money. Dad had wanted to retire. Daniel had believed the company could grow. The lender had demanded stronger guarantees. Costs had increased. Projects had gone badly. He had become desperate. That was the dangerous part. His story was believable. He was not some stranger who had invented an elaborate plan to steal everything from my family. He was a businessman who had entered a legitimate deal, overextended himself, concealed problems, and then started moving boundaries whenever reality stopped matching his plans. One compromise became another. One omission became another, until I became part of the solution. I asked about the altered agreement. Daniel leaned back. Robert prepared the revisions. Did Dad approve them? He knew we needed control provisions. That's not what I asked. Daniel's jaw tightened. Thomas knew the structure was changing. Did he approve those exact pages? Silence. I waited. Finally, Daniel said he could not answer for what Dad remembered. That was enough. Then I asked about the money. He claimed the transfers were consulting fees, deposits, and repayment of money he had previously put into Mercer Holdings. Documentation? My accountant has it. Good, you'll need it. His eyes narrowed. For what? Whatever comes next. He leaned forward. Erin, think carefully. I am. If you cancel this wedding, your father could lose everything. There it was. Not love, not us. Leverage. I kept my voice calm. Explain. If we marry, we can still restructure this. Your trust interest gives us room. We consolidate the property, refinance the loan, bring Matthews Restoration under one holding company, and nobody loses anything, except control. It's a company, Erin. It's my father's life. A life he nearly bankrupted because he refused to change. I flinched. Daniel saw it. He softened his voice. I'm trying to save what he built. By using my property, our property after marriage. No. He stopped. I had never said that word to him with such certainty. My trust would remain mine unless I chose otherwise. Daniel knew that. So did I now. You needed me to agree, I said. Eventually, and you thought being my husband would make that easier. Daniel looked away. I asked the question that had been waiting inside me since the bridal suite. If I owned nothing, would you have called me after that first project? His face changed. For 1 second, I saw the man I had loved. Tired, ashamed, almost honest. I don't know. That answer hurt more than a lie. I nodded. Thank you, he stared at me. For what? For finally telling me the truth. I stood. The wedding is canceled. Daniel rose immediately. Erin, don't make a permanent decision because you're angry. I'm not angry. And I realized it was true. I was devastated, but clear. I removed my engagement ring. Daniel watched it leave my finger. I placed it on the table. He did not touch it. If the lender calls the loan, your father could lose his house. Then we'll deal with that legally. We? My family. Daniel laughed once, bitterly. After what he did to you? I thought about that. Dad had used my life as part of his idea of a future. He had been wrong. Daniel had used my trust as part of his rescue plan. He had been wrong too. But there was a difference neither man seemed to understand yet. Forgiving my father would be my decision. Helping him would be my decision. Walking away from Daniel would be my decision. For the first time, everyone else's plans had stopped mattering. I opened the door. Daniel spoke behind me. Ask your father about the first meeting. I turned. What meeting? The one before I ever came to your office. My stomach tightened. Daniel continued. Ask him whose idea it really was that I meet you. Then he walked past me. I returned to the bridal suite. Dad was standing near the window. Caleb sat beside the table. I closed the door. The wedding is over. Dad shut his eyes. I'm sorry. I looked at him. Daniel told me to ask about your first meeting with him. Dad went completely still. Caleb looked between us. What first meeting? Dad did not answer. I stepped closer. Was Daniel telling the truth when he said meeting me was your idea? Dad's eyes filled with something I had rarely seen in them. Shame, not entirely. My chest tightened. What does that mean? He sat down slowly. Your mother knew Daniel's family. I stared at him. My mother had been dead for 8 years. What does Mom have to do with this? Dad opened the brown envelope again. From the bottom, he removed one final folder. It was old. The edges were worn. Across the front was my mother's handwriting. My name. Erin. Dad placed it in front of me. She made me promise I would give this to you when the time was right. I could barely hear him. When was that supposed to be? When you decided whether you wanted anything to do with Matthew's restoration. I looked at the folder, then at him. 8 years, Dad. I know. Why didn't you give it to me? His answer came quietly. Because after she died, I read it. And I was afraid you would make the choice she wanted instead of the choice I wanted. I opened the folder. Inside were letters, ownership documents, and a signed amendment to my mother's trust. The first page changed everything I thought I knew about the company. Because Matthew's restoration had never belonged entirely to my father. My mother had owned half of it. And according to the documents in my hands, her half had passed to me. I read the page 3 times. Then I looked at my father. Half? Dad nodded. Mom owned half the company? Yes. And you let me believe it was yours. His face tightened. Yes. Caleb stood beside me and leaned over the documents. I kept reading. My mother had not inherited her share. She had earned it. When Dad started Matthew's restoration, Mom had invested money from her inheritance. Later, she handled contracts, payroll, insurance, and client accounts, while Dad managed the physical work. They had built the company together, legally too. Years before her illness, they had reorganized the business. 50% Thomas Matthews, 50% Laura Matthews. After Mom died, her shares had transferred into her trust. The trust named me as beneficiary. I looked at Caleb. He seemed as stunned as I was. Why, Erin? Dad answered. Your mother believed you understood the business side better. Caleb gave a short laugh. She wasn't wrong. There was no resentment in his voice. That somehow made the moment harder. I turned another page. Under the trust terms, Dad had retained voting authority over Mom's shares for a limited period. That authority had expired 18 months earlier. I read the date again. 18 months. Which meant when Dad negotiated with Daniel 8 months ago, he had not controlled the 50% held for me. Dad had negotiated as if he did. My voice came out quiet. You couldn't sell my half. No. Could you pledge it? No. Transfer it? No. Then Daniel was never close to controlling Matthew's restoration. Dad looked at the floor. Not without you. The entire scheme rearranged itself in my mind. Daniel had not needed marriage because marriage magically gave him my assets. It didn't. He needed access, trust, influence, a signature. He needed me to believe consolidating the company and land was a sensible decision made between husband and wife. That was why the wedding mattered. Not because saying I do transferred anything, because afterward he expected me to say yes again, and again, and again. I looked at Dad. Did Daniel know I owned half? Dad hesitated. At first, no. When did he learn? Before he met you. I closed my eyes. There it was, the missing piece. Dad told me their first serious meeting had happened almost a year before Daniel walked into my office. Daniel had approached him about buying Matthew's restoration. Dad refused. Months later, after his health scare and growing cash problems, they spoke again. During that conversation, Dad explained the ownership structure, including me. Daniel had asked whether I was involved in the company. Dad said no. Then Dad made the suggestion he would regret more than any signature. He told Daniel I worked in property operations. He said we would probably get along. I stared at him. You suggested he meet me. Yes. Why? Dad rubbed his hands together. Because I was thinking like a businessman instead of a father. He did not dress it up. That mattered. I thought if you liked Daniel, maybe you'd become interested in the company. Maybe eventually the 3 of us could build something together. So my relationship was part of your succession plan. Dad swallowed. At the beginning, yes, I wanted to scream. Instead, I sat down. That scared me more. My whole engagement had begun inside a conversation I had never been allowed to hear. Caleb asked Dad the question I could not. Did Mom want this? No. Dad answered immediately. Your mother wanted Erin to choose. He looked at me. That was the whole point of the folder. Mom had written me a letter. I unfolded it carefully. I did not read every word then. I couldn't. But one sentence stopped me. My mother had written that ownership was not an obligation. If the company became a burden, I could sell. If I loved it, I could keep it. If I wanted Caleb involved, that should be a conversation between us. Not a duty, not a debt, a choice. I pressed the paper flat against the table. Mom had understood exactly what Dad had forgotten. Love did not create ownership over another person's decisions. I looked at him. I need copies of everything. You'll have them. I also need the contact information for your new attorney. Dad nodded. And from now on, you don't sign anything involving the company without telling me. He almost smiled. You sound like your mother. Don't. The smile vanished. Not today. I took a breath. One more thing. Anything. You don't get to fix this for me. He looked confused. You cooperate. You tell the truth. You provide every document. But you don't call Daniel. You don't negotiate. You don't make another deal because you think you're protecting me. Dad nodded slowly. Understood. I turned to Caleb. I need you to? For what? The guests. I had almost forgotten them. 112 people were still downstairs, waiting for a wedding that would never happen. I asked Caleb to bring Rachel and the coordinator. When they arrived, I told them the ceremony was canceled. Rachel hugged me. I stood stiffly for 1 second. Then I hugged her back. The tears finally came. Not many. Enough. I wiped them away and asked the coordinator to gather everyone in the reception room. She offered to make the announcement for me. I said no. 5 minutes later, I walked into the room. Alone. The conversations stopped one by one. I could see Daniel's parents near the front. My aunt, co-workers, old family friends, people who had traveled hundreds of miles. I did not tell them about contracts. I did not humiliate Daniel. I did not explain my father's role. I simply said that information had come to me that morning, which made it impossible for me to enter a marriage with honesty and trust. So there would be no wedding. A few people gasped. I continued. The food had been paid for. The room was beautiful. Anyone who wished to stay, eat, and spend time together was welcome. It sounded strange, but I refused to let one man's deception turn the entire day into a funeral. Then someone stood. My Aunt Margaret. She walked toward me and hugged me. Then Rachel, then Caleb. Others followed. Dad remained near the back. He understood. This was not his moment. Daniel was gone. I did not see him again that day. By 6 that evening, I had changed into jeans and one of Caleb's sweatshirts. My wedding dress hung inside a garment bag in the hotel room. My engagement ring remained on the conference room table. And I was sitting across from Dad's attorney, Melissa Grant. She had come directly to the hotel after Dad called her. She reviewed my mother's trust documents first, then the corporate records. Then she looked at me. Your father made serious mistakes. Dad sat beside Caleb. He did not object. Melissa continued. But Daniel has a larger problem than he realizes. She explained that because Dad had not controlled my mother's shares, several representations in the acquisition documents were inaccurate. The altered agreement made matters worse. If the electronic records supported Dad's account, Daniel and Robert could face civil claims and professional consequences. What about the loan? Melissa was careful. The loan would not disappear. Dad had signed it. The collateral issue was real. But the lender had relied on representations about an acquisition that had never been completed. That created room to negotiate. Not certainty. Room. I appreciated that she did not promise a miracle. What should we do first? Melissa looked at me. Determine who legally controls Matthew's restoration today. I already knew. Half Dad, half me. She shook her head. Not exactly. She pulled another document from the folder. Your mother's trust contains a provision your father overlooked. Dad leaned forward. What provision? Melissa pointed to a paragraph. If Thomas attempted to transfer, pledge, or encumber company assets beyond his ownership authority, his temporary voting rights over Laura's shares terminated immediately. Dad stared at her. When? Melissa checked the dates. 11 months ago, the day he signed the loan guarantee. I felt my pulse quicken. What does that mean? It means your voting rights became active then. I stared at her. Without knowing, yes, she continued. And because Matthew's restoration's bylaws require majority approval for extraordinary asset transfers, several later actions may never have been properly authorized. For the first time all day, I saw a path forward. Not revenge, not an escape hatch, a path. Over the next 3 weeks, my life became paperwork. I postponed my honeymoon, canceled joint accounts Daniel and I had planned to open, changed passwords, sent formal notice that I disputed any transaction involving my trust or company shares. Melissa contacted the lender. Dad turned over every email. Caleb helped organize decades of company records. And Daniel? Daniel tried to call me 27 times. I answered once. He asked to meet. I agreed. Melissa's office, with attorneys present. He refused, so we did not meet. Then his messages changed. At first, apologetic. Then practical. Then angry. Finally, one arrived at 2 a.m. If you push this, your father loses everything. I saved it. I did not respond. The forensic accountant eventually traced the unexplained transfers. Some were legitimate, some were not. Daniel had used part of the loan to cover debts from 2 unrelated projects owned by Mercer Holdings. He had been moving money to keep his business alive. That discovery gave the lender its own reason to act. Robert Kessler withdrew from representing Daniel shortly afterward. Then the State Bar opened a review into his conduct after Dad's new attorneys submitted the conflicting documents and communications. Nothing happened overnight. That was important. Real consequences rarely arrive with dramatic music. They arrive as certified letters, deadlines, depositions, bank statements, meetings in rooms with bad coffee. 4 months after my wedding day, the lender agreed to restructure Dad's portion of the debt, rather than pursue immediate foreclosure. Matthews Restoration sold 2 unused vehicles and a storage property. Dad contributed savings. The company accepted a manageable repayment schedule. It hurt. But the house remained his. The workshop remained open. Daniel lost his claim to acquire the company. Mercer Holdings entered a separate financial restructuring, and the altered agreement became part of ongoing civil proceedings. I thought that would be the hardest part. It wasn't. The hardest part came one Tuesday afternoon when Dad placed his office keys on my desk. I looked at them. What is this? He sat across from me. My resignation. I stared at him. From your own company? From management. He corrected himself. Our company. I pushed the keys back. I don't want your surrender. It's not surrender. Then what is it? Dad looked toward the workshop through the glass wall. For 32 years, I thought building something meant I had the right to decide what happened to it. He looked at me again. Your mother understood better. I waited. He continued. I want to stay, work on projects, train people, do the part I'm actually good at. And management? You, I almost laughed. I already have a job. I know. Then why are you assuming I want this one? Dad stopped. Then slowly he smiled. You're right. I stared at him. He had finally learned, so I made him wait for my answer. For the first time in our lives, that decision would belong only to me. I made my father wait 11 days, not to punish him. I needed to know whether I actually wanted Matthew's restoration, or whether taking it over would simply be another version of living according to someone else's expectations. So I went back to my regular job. I answered emails, reviewed leases, sat through a 90-minute budget meeting, and every evening I drove to the workshop. Not to manage it, to understand it. I walked job sites with Dad. I sat with the office manager and reviewed contracts. I studied the company's margins, insurance costs, payroll, equipment leases, and project backlog. For the first time, Dad did not hover. He answered when I asked. He stayed quiet when I didn't. Caleb surprised me too. He had never wanted to run the company. I had assumed he did because he was Dad's son. Dad had assumed the same thing. Apparently, we had built an entire family expectation around a conversation nobody had bothered to have. One evening, Caleb and I sat on the tailgate of Dad's truck eating sandwiches after everyone else had gone home. Do you want it? I asked. He laughed. Absolutely not. I laughed too. Then he became serious. But I want to work here. Doing what? Project estimating, maybe client development. That actually suited him. Caleb could walk into a room knowing nobody and leave with 3 phone numbers and an invitation to somebody's barbecue. You'd have to report to someone. I know. Possibly me. He smiled. That's going to be annoying. For both of us. Deal. That conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. It solved something our family had avoided for years. We had confused assumptions with obligations. 11 days after Dad put his keys on my desk, I gave him my answer. I would not leave my job immediately. I would join Matthews Restoration as a board member and co-owner, then spend 6 months evaluating whether I wanted an operating role. Dad agreed. No argument, no disappointment. 6 months later, I became Chief Operating Officer. Because I chose it. That distinction meant everything. Dad stayed with the company as head of restoration projects. For the first few weeks, he still walked into my office and began sentences with what you should do. Eventually, all I had to do was look at him. He would stop. What do you think we should do? He would correct himself. Progress was awkward, but it was progress. The legal mess took much longer. There was no dramatic courtroom victory. No single morning when everything suddenly became fair. There were meetings, bank records, letters from attorneys, long negotiations over numbers I wished my father had never agreed to. Eventually, the lender accepted a restructuring after reviewing the problems surrounding the proposed acquisition and Daniel's use of part of the loan money for unrelated Mercer Holdings debts. Matthews Restoration still had to pay. Dad had signed the guarantee. His mistakes did not disappear simply because Daniel had made worse ones. We sold 2 unused vehicles and the storage property. Dad used part of his savings. The company entered a repayment plan that hurt, but did not destroy us. The workshop stayed open. Dad kept his house. My mother's shares remained mine. And Daniel lost every claim he had tried to build around Matthews Restoration. Mercer Holdings did not survive. Robert Kessler faced a professional review over his role in the conflicting documents. I followed those proceedings only as much as Melissa told me I needed to. At first, I wanted every update, every consequence, every loss. Then one afternoon, I realized I had gone almost 2 weeks without asking about Daniel. That felt better than revenge ever could. Almost a year after the canceled wedding, Daniel requested one final meeting. Our settlement had been completed that morning. There was nothing left to negotiate. Melissa asked whether I wanted to see him. I almost said no. Then I realized there was still one question I wanted answered. Daniel and I sat across from each other in Melissa's conference room. He looked tired. So did I, probably. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he apologized. Not for the contracts, not for the money, for me. He said he had convinced himself that because his feelings became real, the way our relationship began no longer mattered. I asked him the only question I had left. Did you love me? He looked down. Yes. Then he added something I believed. But I knew what you owned before I knew who you were. That was it. The whole relationship in one sentence. Something real had grown from something dishonest. And real feelings had not made the dishonesty harmless. Why didn't you tell me? Daniel looked at his hands. Because the longer I waited, the more I had to lose. I nodded. I understood that now. One hidden truth creates another. Then another. Eventually, honesty becomes the most expensive choice in the room. Daniel looked at me. I never wanted to hurt you. Maybe not. I stood. But you were willing to let me make the biggest decision of my life without knowing the truth. He had no answer. I left without asking for one. That was the last time I saw him. My relationship with Dad took longer to repair. There was no single apology that fixed us. He had to learn that protecting me did not mean deciding for me. I had to learn that forgiving him did not mean pretending nothing had happened. At Matthews Restoration, we created rules that should have existed years earlier. Major financial decisions required documented approval. Ownership records were updated. Outside counsel reviewed significant contracts. Caleb joined the company in business development, exactly where he wanted to be. Dad returned to the part of the work he loved most, restoration. He trained younger crews, inspected difficult projects, and complained whenever I reminded him he was no longer allowed to make financial commitments with a handshake. He also stopped assuming that being my father gave him the final word. Sometimes he still began with "what you should do is," then he would catch himself. "What do you think?" It became our little signal, proof that people could change, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. One Sunday afternoon, nearly 3 years after the wedding that never happened, Dad and I were alone at the workshop. We had spent the morning reviewing plans for the restoration of an old courthouse. Before I left, he called me into his office. There was a small wooden box on his desk. I recognized it immediately. It had belonged to Mom. She used to keep photographs inside. Dad pushed it toward me. I opened it. On top was a photograph of my parents standing outside Matthews Restoration shortly after they bought the building. Dad looked impossibly young. Mom was holding a paint roller in one hand. There was white paint on her jeans. I turned the photograph over. 6 words were written on the back in her handwriting. Build something you can still leave. I read them again. Dad stood beside me. For years, I thought she meant the company. I looked at him. And now? He was quiet for a moment. I think she meant you should never build anything that becomes your prison. I ran my thumb across Mom's handwriting. A business, a marriage, even a family. Anything could become a prison if love was used to take away someone's right to choose. Dad reached for the photograph, then stopped. Can I? I handed it to him. He smiled at Mom's face. I owe you something, he said. You owe me quite a few things. He laughed softly. Fair enough. Then his expression changed. I'm sorry I didn't walk you down the aisle. For a moment, I was back in that bridal suite. The dress, the flowers, my phone shaking in my hand, the closed door after Dad walked away. I had once thought that would become the most painful memory of my life. It didn't. I'm not sorry, I said. Dad looked at me. You refusing was the first honest thing anyone did for me that day. His eyes filled. He nodded. We put the photograph back inside the box and walked toward the front of the workshop. At the door, Dad held out his arm. I looked at it. What? He smiled. I missed my chance last time. I laughed. Then I took his arm. We walked together across the parking lot. No music, no flowers, no guests waiting. And nobody deciding where I was supposed to go next. That was the difference. For most of my life, I had confused love with obligation. I thought being a good daughter meant carrying problems my father created. I thought trust meant not asking difficult questions. I thought commitment meant staying when leaving would disappoint people. I know better now. Dad did not save me from Daniel. Caleb did not save me. My mother's documents did not save me. They gave me information. The decision was still mine. I stopped the wedding. I asked the questions. I refused to trade my future for someone else's financial survival. And I learned that boundaries do not destroy healthy families. Sometimes they are the reason a family finally becomes healthy. My father never walked me down the aisle. But years later, when I think about that day, I don't see myself as the bride who was abandoned before her wedding. I see a woman standing at the entrance to a life other people had quietly designed for her. And for the first time, she chose not to enter. Walking away did not cost me my future. It gave my future back to me. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. If it touched your heart, please subscribe because I share a brand new family story here every single day. And if you're not ready to leave yet, open the next story on your screen. I have a feeling it will stay with you just as long.